Right now, somewhere in your city, a bridge is cracking, a pipe is rusting, a road is crumbling at the edges, and nobody has noticed yet. You walk over it every day. You don't think about it. And that is exactly how the greatest empire in human history disappeared. You've probably heard the story before: barbarians at the gates, a weak emperor, a final battle, a burning city, and the lights of civilization going dark. It's a good story. It's also almost completely wrong. The real reason Rome fell wasn't a single invasion. It wasn't one bad emperor or one lost battle or one barbarian king with a grudge. The real reason is far stranger and far more familiar than you think. Because the thing that killed Rome is still happening, quietly, in the systems you rely on today. Ready? Let's go back 1900 years. At its peak, around the year 117, Rome wasn't just a city, it was a machine. 5 million square kilometers of territory, 60 million people living under one law, one currency, one road network. 40,000 miles of paved roads connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria. A letter could travel from London to Damascus in weeks. Grain grown in North Africa fed bakeries in the capital. This wasn't luck, it was logistics, built over centuries, and it worked so well that most people alive in the empire had never known anything else. Historian Kyle Harper, who studies the environmental history of Rome, calls this the empire's engineered stability. Everything depended on everything else. The army needed grain, the grain needed ships, the ships needed calm seas and functioning ports, the ports needed taxes. The taxes needed a stable currency. Pull one thread, and you'd think the whole thing would just keep standing because it always had. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. That interdependence, the very thing that made Rome the most powerful civilization on Earth, was also its greatest vulnerability. When a system becomes complex enough, it doesn't need a single catastrophic blow to fail. It just needs enough small failures happening at the same time. Think about that bridge cracking in your city right now. One crack doesn't collapse a bridge, but ignore 10,000 cracks spread across every bridge, every pipe, every road, all quietly forming for decades, and eventually you don't need an earthquake. You just need one Tuesday. That's what happened to Rome. Not one earthquake. Thousands of quiet cracks. Start with the money. In the 2nd century, a Roman silver coin called the denarius was genuinely silver, close to 90%. By the middle of the 3rd century, that same coin was less than 5% silver. Emperors kept minting more coins to pay soldiers and fund wars, but they didn't have more silver to back them, so they diluted it. Economist and historian Peter Temin, who studied the Roman economy using modern economic tools, has shown this wasn't a one-time panic decision. It was policy repeated for generations because short-term problems always felt more urgent than long-term consequences. Prices exploded. A modius of wheat that cost a handful of coins under Emperor Augustus cost hundreds of times more by the year 301 when Emperor Diocletian tried to freeze prices by law. It didn't work. You cannot legislate away a currency that has already lost the trust of the people using it. Sound familiar? Now add the climate. This is the part historians only pieced together in the last 15 years using ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from the Alps. Kyle Harper and climate scientist Michael McCormick found that the centuries of Rome's rise coincided almost perfectly with an unusually warm, stable, wet climate across the Mediterranean. Historians now call this window the Roman climate optimum. Good weather meant good harvests. Good harvests meant a well-fed army, a well-fed population, and a stable tax base. Then, starting around 150 AD, the climate began to shift, not dramatically, not overnight, just slightly cooler, slightly less predictable, slightly more prone to drought in some years and flooding in others. A slight shift in climate doesn't sound like it should topple an empire, but Rome's agricultural system was optimized for the old climate, not the new one. Harvests became less reliable exactly when the empire needed them most, and then came the third piece, the one that changed everything: disease. In 165 AD, a plague swept through the empire, likely smallpox, carried home by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Historians call it the Antonine Plague, and estimates suggest it killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, a staggering fraction of the empire's population. It hit the army especially hard, which meant fewer soldiers to defend an already stretched frontier. Then, in 249 AD, a second, even worse pandemic arrived. The Plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop who described its horrifying symptoms in vivid detail. Whole towns were emptied. Roman writer Cyprian described people too afraid to bury their own dead. Historian Kyle Harper has argued this second plague may have been even more devastating than the first, striking right in the middle of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome had more than 20 emperors in 50 years, most of them murdered or overthrown. Do you see the pattern forming? A currency quietly losing value for decades, a climate quietly shifting against the empire's food supply, a disease arriving right when the system had the least capacity to absorb the shock. None of these alone would have ended Rome. Together, they didn't leave room for anything else to go wrong, but something else did go wrong, and this is the twist almost nobody expects. You'd assume the barbarians were always Rome's enemy, hammering at the gates for centuries until the walls finally gave way. But for most of Roman history, the peoples living beyond the frontier, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, weren't trying to destroy Rome, they wanted in. For generations, groups living along Rome's borders traded with the empire, served in its armies, and adopted its goods, its language, sometimes even its religion. Many wanted Roman citizenship, Roman land, Roman protection. Historian Peter Heather, who has spent decades studying this period, argues that the fall of Rome wasn't a story of destruction from outside, it was a story of migration under pressure, meeting an empire that could no longer absorb it. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Gothic refugees arrived at the Roman frontier, fleeing a terrifying new threat from the east, the Huns, a nomadic people sweeping in from the steppes of Central Asia. The Goths didn't come to conquer, they came begging for asylum. Rome let them in, but mismanaged the resettlement so badly, with corrupt officials selling food at outrageous prices and treating desperate refugees with contempt, that within 2 years those same refugees were in open revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Roman army led by the emperor himself was annihilated by the very Goths. Rome had let inside its own borders. Emperor Valens was killed. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and it happened not because barbarians broke in, but because Rome's own systems failed the people it had just accepted. Now picture that moment, not the battle, the moment right before it. Thousands of desperate people at a border, an empire deciding how to respond, officials choosing short-term profit over long-term stability. Does any part of that sound like something you've read about in the news this year? History doesn't repeat, but the patterns underneath it often do. The end, when it finally came in the West, wasn't dramatic either. In 410 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric, a man who had once served in the Roman army, sacked the city of Rome itself. It shocked the ancient world. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described the shock rippling across the empire, saying that the city which had conquered the world was itself conquered. But Rome didn't fall in that moment. The empire limped on for another 66 years, weaker every decade, its borders shrinking, its currency worthless, its armies increasingly made up of the same peoples it once called barbarians. Finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic military leader named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and didn't even bother replacing him with another puppet ruler. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and said, essentially, the West doesn't need an emperor anymore. No battle, no burning capital, just paperwork, a shrug, and an empire that had already been hollowed out for generations finally admitting it out loud. So what actually killed Rome? Not one thing. A currency debased slowly enough that people stopped noticing until it was too late. A climate that shifted just enough to undercut the food supply exactly when stability mattered most. A disease that arrived at the worst possible moment. Not once, but twice. A migration crisis mismanaged by officials chasing short-term gain. And a political system so unstable that it couldn't coordinate a response to any of it because it was too busy fighting itself. Here's the reframe. Every one of those pressures existed for decades before the fall. People living through the 3rd century didn't wake up one day and think, this is the end of Rome. They just noticed things were harder than they used to be. Prices climbing, harvests less predictable, news of plague in the next province, a cousin's son who never came back from the frontier. Life simply got a little worse, year after year, until one day the whole system that had held it all together simply stopped holding. That's the part historians want you to understand. Collapse doesn't usually look like an explosion. It looks like erosion. It looks like normal, slightly worsening, for so long that by the time it's undeniable, it's already too late to reverse. Which brings us back to that bridge cracking in your city right now, to the currency in your wallet, the climate outside your window, the systems you trust without thinking about because they've always worked before. Rome's engineers built roads so well that some of them are still visible today, nearly 2,000 years later. Its administrators built a currency system so trusted that it circulated across 3 continents. Its people believed reasonably that a civilization this vast and this advanced simply could not fail. They were wrong, not because they were foolish, but because the failure didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived as 1,000 small ones, stacking quietly until the weight became impossible to hold. Tonight, when you cross a bridge or check your bank balance or read about weather patterns shifting somewhere in the world, you're not so different from a Roman citizen in the year 250. You're standing inside a system so vast and so normal that its permanence feels like a fact of nature. It isn't. It never was, not even for Rome. The lights didn't go out all at once. They dimmed, one crack at a time, until nobody could remember what full brightness had even looked like.